Sitting atop a slumbering volcano, Yellowstone National Park is home to more hydrothermal activity than any other place in the world. From this to dangerous wildlife to frequently erupting geysers, this national park is made up of land that, on paper, seems like it should be too dangerous to visit. In particular, there are many hot springs found within the park. These hydrothermal features are essentially pools of water that has seeped down into the earth, becoming superheated by Yellowstone's bedrock, before rising back to the surface. Despite the fact that some of these thermal pools can reach 456 degrees Fahrenheit, millions of tourists travel to these features every year, hoping to get close to one. This is largely because the pools themselves are undoubtedly beautiful. They shimmer with hues ranging from bright yellows to oranges to deep greens and blues. Interestingly, this correlation is due to microorganisms called thermophiles that thrive in the hot springs temperatures. The Park Service has built sturdy boardwalks that allow visitors to see these beautiful sights without getting too close. But as we will see all too often, visitors blatantly disregard the many cautionary signs, walking off the boardwalks to capture a closer glimpse of these alluring waters. Sometimes, though, nature's beauty can be deadly, and these stories often end in tragedy. This is precisely what happened to 23-year-old Colin Scott in 2016. Colin and his sister Sable were touring the Norris Geyser Basin on the west side of Yellowstone National Park. Norris is one of the largest thermal basins in the park, and because it's closest to the subterranean magma than any other, it's also the hottest and most acidic. In short, it's a beautiful but extremely volatile stretch of land. The two siblings walked along the boardwalk that winds through this section of the park, admiring the intense beauty that surrounded them. But at some point, they decided that in order to get the best views, they'd need to get a little closer. Ignoring the dozens of danger signs, the pair stepped off the designated boardwalk, while Sable filmed the charming landscape near the Pork Chop Geyser. At 225 yards away from ensured safety, they began testing the waters of different pools, hoping to find a pocket of water that was hot but not too hot to soak in. This may sound alarming, but soaking in hydrothermal features called hot springs by enthusiasts is not an uncommon activity. Of course, given its inherent danger, it's also highly illegal. As Colin walked across the uneven crust to check the temperature of a pool, he suddenly slipped and fell into a strongly acidic hot spring. Still filming this entire incident, Sable attempted to rescue her brother, but her efforts were to no avail. Sadly, fully submerged as he was in superheated water, Colin was quickly overcome and sank beneath the surface. Unable to go in after her brother, and in an area with no cell reception, Sable sprinted to a nearby museum screaming for help. But when park rangers returned to the area, it was far too late. According to the incident report, rescuers could see a body floating in the water, with a small crucifix resting on the victim's face. Colin's father would later confirm that Colin wore a crucifix. Due to safety concerns and a brewing thunderstorm, they were unable to recover his body that evening. When returning the next morning, rescuers searched the pool via a long stick, but by this time, Colin's body was nowhere to be found. The temperature of the hot springs that day was reported to be a blistering 212 degrees Fahrenheit, and the acidity was recorded with a pH of 5, strongly suggesting that Colin's body quickly dissolved due to the acidity and extreme heat. Colin Scott met a tragic fate that day, but his story reminds us to never stray from established trails in the parks, especially when just one misstep can prove fatal. This next case of death by Yellowstone hot springs reminds us to be aware of our surroundings at all times and to always bring flashlights when wandering the wilderness. In August of 2000, a group of employees of the park were enjoying the end of their summer job by taking an afternoon swim in the Firehole River. Located in the west-south central of Yellowstone National Park, the Firehole River is one of two swimming areas inside the park. Though the name Firehole may sound menacing, it was given this moniker simply for the wisps of steam that rise from the water's surface, making it appear to be smoking as if on fire. And it's a beautifully refreshing area to take a dip, especially for young adults just looking for some after-work end-of-summer fun. But as the group enjoyed their downtime, nobody paid much attention to the fact that the sun had already begun to set, and the light was quickly fading. Because they weren't expecting to be out till dark, no one in the group thought to bring a flashlight. This didn't worry them, though, after all, they'd spent the entire summer in the park and knew this area like the backs of their hands. They were confident they could navigate the land safely. So, in high spirits, the bunch made their journey homeward. Guided by only the pale light of the late summer moon, the group moved quickly through the darkened backcountry. But three of them, Lance Buki, Taylor Montague, and Sarah Halfers, lagged behind the rest of their friends. Perhaps less confident in their navigational skills than the rest of their peers, they clasped hands to help guide each other. Eventually, the trio came upon an embankment that they didn't quite recognize. Just below, a wide, bubbling pit of superheated water lay unassuming before them. But in the dim light, this pit appeared to be little more than a narrow stream, easily crossable. Entirely oblivious to the danger before them, the three leapt over the pool together, barely managing to land on the dirt protrusion on the other side. But before they could regain their footing, the ledge of dirt crumbled below them, simultaneously plunging Lance, Tyler, and Sarah into the boiling water. Further up the trail, the rest of the group heard the trio's cries for help and immediately rushed back to their aid. By the time they got there, Lance and Tyler had been able to pull themselves out of the pool, and a few friends took them to the nearby Old Faithful clinic for help. The other friends pulled Sarah from the blistering water and waited beside her until help arrived. It's believed that because she was much shorter than the two young men, she had been the most thoroughly immersed, exposing her entire body to the boiling water and making her condition much, much worse. Park spokeswoman Marsha Curl said the small group moved Sarah back to the Firehole River and placed her in the water, hoping to cool and relieve her injuries. Medical assistance finally arrived 30 minutes later, and the three victims were driven to the west side of Yellowstone, then airlifted by helicopter to Idaho Falls, and then finally flown by plane to Salt Lake City. 18-year-olds Tyler and Lance both survived, but were left with second and third-degree burns. Tyler having over 70% of his body burned, and Lance over 90%. 20-year-old Sarah Halfers suffered third-degree burns on her entire body, and tragically died in the hospital. According to those around her, Sarah was incredibly happy working in Yellowstone that summer, and her loss was deeply felt by her colleagues and loved ones. Of the 22 Yellowstone National Park hot springs deaths, all of them are horrific results of accidents or careless behavior, except this one. In July of 1981, David Kerwin and his friend Ronald Radcliffe were driving through Yellowstone's Fountain Paint Pod thermal area, accompanied by Ronald's dog Moosey. Because dogs are prohibited near the boiling mud pits, the two men parked their truck and left Moosey behind. Moosey, eager to explore the new environment, somehow escaped from the vehicle and ran to find her owner and his friend. She eventually found them casually observing the hot spring. Seeing nothing but a pool of water, Moosey excitedly ran past the two men and jumped headlong into the nearby Celestine pool. Startled by the yelps and cries of his friend's dog, David began preparing himself to leap in after the dog. Onlookers warned and begged David not to jump in, but David shouted back, "Like hell I won't." He then took 2 steps into the 202-degree water and then dove in headfirst after Moosey. David swam to his friend's dog trying to assist her out, but his excruciating injuries overwhelmed him and he swam to shore to try to preserve himself. Ronald stepped into the water to pull David out, giving himself second-degree burns on his feet. Moosey quickly perished in the boiling cauldron, but sadly David's demise would be much slower. After emerging from the pool, witnesses reported David's eyes looking whitish and blind, and when a park visitor tried removing one of his shoes, David's skin slipped off with it. But despite these horrific injuries, David remained coherent and managed to mutter that he was stupid. "How bad am I? That was a stupid thing I did." David was hastily transferred to the Old Faithful Clinic after being administered fluids and medicine for his pain. He was taken to a hospital in Salt Lake City, where, tragically, he would succumb to his injuries the next morning. Though they are somewhat infrequent, deaths in Yellowstone's hot springs date back many, many years. Our next story will take us back to August of 1905, when 40-year-old Miss Fanny Wiley was enjoying her stay at Yellowstone National Park. She was touring with a small group of other park visitors led by Robert Wiley, who was reported to provide extremely interesting guided trips. The bunch was travelling via stagecoach on Yellowstone's dirt road system. Robert walked us to our group through the southwest section of the park around Old Faithful, the park's first named and most frequently erupting geyser. Robert later reported that Miss Fanny was most captivated by the hot springs. Taking notice of this, he warned her of the dangers, claiming she was too venturesome. Dressed in her all-black attire, with a fashionable black veil covering her face, Miss Fanny likely ignored Robert's cautionary advice. With the steaming hot springs surrounding her, she removed her foggy glasses to wipe them clear. But negligent of the uneven terrain around her, Miss Fanny stepped backward and directly into a scalding pool of water, plunging clear to her hips in water that reached 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Robert leapt into the water to rescue her, giving himself sweltering burns on his legs, arms and hands. Though Miss Fanny hadn't been fully submerged, she was wearing multiple petticoats that continued inflicting burns on her for some time after, due to them still being soaking wet with hot water. She stayed alive for 3 weeks, but eventually died of her injuries on September the 4th. Her friend Miss Hartman was at her bedside until the very end. Miss Fanny's tragic death was used as a frightening horror tale by tour guides in Yellowstone for many years to come. Another early 20th century hot spring fatality takes the cake for being the most unbelievable. In August of 1926, Reverend Gilbert A. Aikens was enjoying his Yellowstone visit with his family, his wife Patty, his son, and his parents. It was nearing sundown, so the group was likely briskly walking through the West Thumb Geyser Basin, the park's largest geyser basin on the shores of Yellowstone Lake. Reverend Gilbert must have lost his footing, because suddenly he fell into a piping hot pool of water. In an attempt to escape the pool, which at this point had only burned the lower half of his body, he accidentally plunged into another. Likely confused by the pain of his blistering burns, the Reverend unbelievably dove headfirst into the first pool he fell in. Even still, despite having been completely submerged, he somehow managed to crawl out of the spring and back onto dry land. A nearby ranger and doctor, Wendell Keith, heard the cries of a man screaming at the top of his lungs that he'd fallen into the hot springs and was badly burned. Another witness, a government truck driver named Mr. Halstead, ran with Wendell to the man's aid. The two carefully laid Reverend Gilbert on the ground and, using Mr. Halstead's knife, began cutting his clothes away. Even in the dim moonlight, Wendell was able to notice that as he removed his clothing, the Reverend's skin was peeling off with it. In just minutes, a large crowd of bystanders formed, curious to see what all the commotion was. Wendell requested some sort of comforter be placed beneath the man to ensure no foreign material stuck to and inside his burns. Once more, medical help arrived. Wendell administered half grain of morphine to relieve the Reverend's suffering. In an effort to soothe and heal the burns themselves, 3 pints of olive oil taken from a nearby road camp were used to saturate his entire body. Wendell also obtained 2 sheets from a nearby camping company, wrapping them around the Reverend and soaking these sheets in oil as well. Despite these efforts, the moment he had been fully immersed in the water, Reverend Gilbert's fate had likely already been sealed. Unknown to his caretakers at the time, his burns were just as bad internally as they were externally. Still, Wendell gave him mineral oil by mouth, hoping to soothe the burns on his esophagus and trachea, sustained by gulping in the boiling water. Reverend Gilbert remained fully conscious until he died from shock. After his death, his wife, Patty Aikens, attempted to obtain justice for her husband. She claimed that the particular pool he fell in was unnervingly close to the boardwalks, which were open to all the public. She stated that she wished ropes or railings would be placed around the pool, preventing others from meeting the same fatal fate as her husband. At this point, you might be wondering, is there a solution? If Yellowstone is so unsafe, why aren't greater safety measures taken? In reality, even fenced-in hot springs, tourists guided by tour guides, railings, and repeated warnings can't change the fact that Yellowstone is a wilderness, and to make it completely safe means making it no longer wild. In short, the solution is not sanitation, but education. When visiting such charming, untamed nature, always be aware of the unforgiving wilderness around you. And if you visit Yellowstone, whatever you do, always stay on the boardwalk. This has been Gripping Horror. I hope to see you in the next one.